Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana, and I am so excited to be celebrating 10 years of meaningful conversations with you. As we step into our new primetime hour, it's such an honor to share this exciting new chapter with you. So whether you're starting your day out, headed to work, or listening from wherever you are, this hour is designed to bring you thoughtful dialogue, fresh insight, and inspiring stories so you can make every moment count. So thank you for being here with me today, and let's dive in. We're here today with special guest, Laura Burges, who's here to share with us Wisdom Stories of Tibet, tales of magic, adventure, and bravery. So what hidden truths about compassion and bravery might these ancient Tibetan tales reveal for our lives today? Well, our guest is here to dive into just that. Laura Burges is a Soto Zen teacher who received monastic training at the Zen Mountain Center. She teaches at San Francisco Zen Center and other practice centers in Northern California. The book we'll be talking about today, Wisdom Stories of Tibet, Tales of Magic, Adventure, and Bravery, won gold in the Moonbeam Children's Book Awards. So welcome to the show, Laura Burges.
Thank you so much for having me, Marianne. I've enjoyed our conversations in the past.
Well, I'm so delighted that we get to talk about this book. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, I had written several books for Shambhala Publications, and they contacted me and asked me if I would like to write a series of wisdom books from different countries. And the countries they had in mind were Tibet, India, and Japan. And I was hesitant to do that until I was told I would be collaborating with a person from each of those cultures. And this led to a really rich and fun and learning process for me to be directed towards certain stories from these countries, and then to have the freedom to play with them in my own voice and my own style to bring them to life for today's readers. As you know, I taught children for many years, and so this was a way for me to continue doing something for children after I retired as a teacher. And Wisdom Stories of Tibet was such a pleasure for me to write. I was working with Lama Chonam, who's a wonderful Tibetan Lama, grew up in the Tibetan tradition and lives in the United States now. And, we haven't met in person. He feels like we knew each other in previous lifetimes. We laughed so much. It was all on Zoom. And we'd love to meet one another, but this story is one of the treasures that comes out of Zoom, which, opens the world to people in so many ways.
Well, it's such a beautifully illustrated book. How did you decide, which stories to include? I'm sure you probably had a few.
Well, I have to take my hat off to Wen Su, the fabulous artist. She's a Chinese artist who lives in Costa Rica, and she was suggested to me by Shambhala. When they sent me her portfolio and I saw the amazing illustrations she does, they wanted me to write each of these 3 books, and they wanted her to illustrate each of them. And she does a tremendous amount of research to make sure that they're authentic. And in terms of choosing the stories, Lama Chonam would suggest certain stories, and most of the ones that he suggested were stories from his childhood or from the Tibetan tradition. And I chose the ones that I felt would be interesting to children and appropriate for them, and would open the world of Tibetan practice to these kids. For all 3 of these books, I've sometimes had to ameliorate some of the violence in the original stories, which were actually intended for adults in many cases. But I'll tell you a funny story about working with Lama Chonam. One of the stories in the book it's from an epic series of stories about a wonderful king who came to be. And when he was a child, he was sent off into exile And then these Tibetan warlords went to visit him because they knew he was a wise man and they wanted to seek his advice. And so they sought him out, and he became King Gesar when he won a horse race that was staged to pick the next king. Well, I was having fun playing with gender, so I suggested to Lama Chonam that the horse that the king rode in this horse race could be a mare, just to get some female energy into these stories. And he said, "Oh, no. A king would never ride a mare." So, it was those kind of things that he could help me. He was very lenient with me about playing with certain things, but he wanted to make sure that the stories would flow and be accessible and agreeable to Tibetan people. And he said a Tibetan person reading a story where a king is riding a mare would be quite taken aback. And another thing that happened in working with him on this book, Wisdom Stories of Tibet, was that in part of the story, when these warlords come to visit King Gesar in exile, I said he was waiting for them with hot tea. And Lama Chonam said, "Well, it wouldn't have been tea. It would have been wine." And I said, "Well, Lama Chonam, I don't really want to have wine in a children's story, and I don't choose to drink alcohol myself." And there was a pause, and then he said, "How about juice boxes?"
Oh my gosh.
And that's an example of his wonderful sense of humor, and also how hip he is to American culture, that he knows kids drink juice boxes. The story that I like to read to you is The Mouse Queen. And of course, the original story was The Mouse King. And, knowing that both girls and boys would be reading these stories, I really did need to bring some fresh female energy to the book. But of course, many of the figures in this book are historical figures of from Tibetan history, powerful women practitioners from Tibet. So shall I read the story to you?
Oh, I would love that.
Okay, and this has a beautiful illustration of the little mouse queen coming to visit Songtsen Gampo, the king of Tibet at the time. And let me just say a little bit about Songtsen Gampo. He was the king who brought Buddhism to Tibet. The culture was more animistic and until that time, and he brought Buddhist practice and Buddhist thought to Tibet. So he's a very beloved figure in Tibet. The Mouse Queen. Songtsen Gampo, the king, who is known as the reincarnation of the Buddha of Compassion, sat on his throne in his brocaded robes, twiddling his thumbs. It had been a long, hot, dull day, so his eyes lit up when his attendant announced that he had a visitor. The king sat up a little straighter on his throne. "Well, by all means, show him in." "It's a she, Your Highness." The king was surprised when his attendant ushered in a small creature that looked very much like a mouse. In fact, though she was dressed in the finest robes and wore a tiny silk cap trimmed with fur, the king had to admit that she probably was, indeed, a mouse. Her black eyes sparkled with a sharp intelligence as she said with a low bow, "Your Highness, I trust you are well and resting in Buddha's warm hand." The king was delighted with his tiny visitor. "And I hope you are in good health." "Well, that's what brings me here today. I am the Mouse Queen. I may not look like you, but I'm sure that we both care deeply about the welfare of our subjects. Until now, we mice have been able to live quite well on your leftovers. But as you know, there is a famine over the land and not much for us to eat. I've come to seek your help. Since you follow the way of the Buddha, I am hoping that I can touch your wisdom and your compassion." The king was deeply moved by the grace and dignity of this tiny leader. He bowed his head with respect. "What can I do for you?" "Could you offer some of your grain to my subjects? If we could have some barley, it would save our lives. We will pay you back with interest. The king hesitated, but was so moved by the courage of his visitor that he found himself replying, "Very well, but you may have only as much as you can take with you in 1 hour. After all, I must make sure my people also have enough to eat." At once the king summoned the guards of one of the low stone buildings where the barley was stored and asked them to open the heavy wooden doors when it got dark. That night, hundreds of tiny mice swarmed over the land to the storage area. They filled bag after bag with barley and quickly sewed up the bags with tiny needles and thread. Carrying the bags on their small shoulders, they took the barley to the caves where they lived so that they would have food for the winter. They had enough for themselves, yet left plenty for the king. An hour later, there wasn't a single mouse to be seen. Songston Gampo was impressed that so much barley could be taken away by such small creatures in such a short time. A few months later, the country on the other side of the river declared war on Tibet. To the king's surprise, the Mouse Queen appeared once again in his court. "I told you that we would pay you back with interest, and I've come to make good on my promise. I hear that you have been threatened with war by a neighboring country. Don't worry. My subjects will save you, and following the Buddha's teaching not to kill, we will overcome your enemies without taking a single life." The king was speechless, but he remembered how, working together, the mice had skillfully carried off the barley, so he merely bowed and said, "Thank you, Your Highness." And he smiled to himself because, after all, the tiny Mouse Queen wasn't very high at all. Yet he trusted her completely. The next dark night at midnight, the Mouse Queen stood on the bank of the river, looking across to where the opposing army had gathered and set up camp. At her command, the mice gathered with her by the hundreds. She gave a signal, and with their sharp teeth, they cut broad, thick leaves from the nearby bushes and silently launched these fat, flat green boats over the water, using tiny sticks for oars, 3 or 4 mice on each leaf. They pulled the leaves up onto the opposite shore, and in the dead of night they entered the enemy's camp. As the soldiers slept, snoring loudly, the silent mice proceeded to chew holes in everything they could find: blankets, tents, boots, socks, bows, and arrows. They ate every speck of food they could find. Then, just as silently as they had arrived, they boarded their leaf boats and rowed back across the river. In the morning, when the soldiers woke up and found everything in shreds, they fled, thinking that they had been visited by demons in the night. Tibet was safe. The next day, the Mouse Queen once again visited the king of Tibet. "How I thank you and your subjects for your cleverness, bravery, and kindness. You have saved the Tibetan people from the horror of war," said King Songston Gampo with a low bow. "Well, Your Highness, there is one thing you could do." And by that evening, every cat in the kingdom had been captured and taken safely across the wide river, never to be seen again. At the end of each of these stories, there's a kind of moral, I would say. And here's one for this story. Even the smallest of creatures can confront the powerful if they have faith in themselves, in one another, and in the wisdom and compassion of Buddha's teaching.
What a great story. I love that. Yeah, and your book has so many wonderful stories like this. What are some of the themes that you would say that were within this book?
Well, I would say the book holds within its covers a lot of compassion, a lot of skillful wisdom. Humor is important to me and to all of us, so I included that wherever I could. And there are some elements from my third graders, riddles that they've told me and humor that we've had in our classroom. So I kept my third graders in mind as I wrote these stories, knowing what they would like and appreciate. And again, making sure that women were reflected in these stories. And the women in the stories are quite heroic. I think really the theme is the Dalai Lama says, "My religion is kindness." And so in these stories, you see people, sometimes very common, ordinary people, finding great courage and wisdom within themselves and confronting the difficulties of their days. And in some cases, speaking truth to power and overcoming evil influences during those times. Tibetan has a long, rich history.
Well, I think they were so skillfully done and brought together, and the illustrations are just gorgeous within this book. What do you hope happens with this book? Are you wanting parents to read these books with their children and share some of the insights?
It's funny you asked me that, Marianne, because often on back to school night, I would talk about my dad who read to me every single night. And I would say, my father died a number of years ago, but when I asked him, what he looked back on fondly in his life, he said, camping with you kids and reading to you. And he was able to introduce to us books that were a little beyond our comprehension. And we would stop and talk about them. And, sometimes moral issues would come up in the stories that we would discuss, rather than refusing to read a book to us that he might not have agreed with. We would talk about them and discuss them. And you might see, of course, Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little were books he read to us. And there's a little homage to Stuart Little in that book where I say she looked very much like a mouse. That might be a line directly from Stuart Little. So I hope that these books open children to the wonders of, to open them to a much wider world, because these stories from Tibet, some of them are quite unusual. There's a story in here about two boys who are friends. One of them is very well behaved and very well respected in his town. The other boy is growing up in an abusive household and is quite unkind to everyone except his friend. And in the end, in a very mysterious, magical way that I won't share here, they change places. And so the friend who's being raised with unkindness and violence becomes a kind and helpful person in his community. So these messages, I think, are timeless, really. And although this is, billed as a children's book, I think anyone who's interested in Tibet and Tibetan thinking and Tibetan Buddhism will really enjoy these stories. I'm a Dharma teacher in the Zen tradition, and I've shared these stories with adults. And, we have a lot of fun with these stories. So I hope they find a wide audience and that children stop and think, about their behavior in the world. And they know from these stories that what we do in the world can make a difference. We can make a difference in the world. And I think these stories radiate that truth from ancient times.
Well, I always find your work so impactful and it touches so many people. Where would you like readers and our listeners to connect with you and learn more about your work?
Well, you can email me at Laura Burges with one S, that's important, lauraburges8@gmail.com. And I want to say, I have such great gratitude for Lama Chonam and the work he does in the world, bringing peace to people, and his wonderful teachings, and also to Wen Su for her very compassionate and, historically authentic illustrations. I think when I told Wen Su that when I think of the children's books I loved, the illustrations are very, very vivid in my mind. And I think these illustrations will stay with children. And I hope this book, Wisdom Stories of Tibet, will engage readers and lead them to read the next book, which is Wisdom Stories of India, and that's coming out May 26th. My next book comes out next year, Wisdom Stories of Japan. And in each of these books, I've had such wonderful support and collaboration.
Well, I know we're going to be talking again in May. I cannot wait for the next book to come out. Laura, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, thank you, Marianne, and thank you to your readers, your listeners. You know, reading is so important. Reading is what connects us. It reminds us that we're not alone. And reading connects us with different worlds and different ideas and opens our hearts to the unfamiliar. I was an avid reader as a child, and it means the world to me to be presenting books to children now in my later life. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Laura. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your children's book, Wisdom Stories of Tibet, Tales of Magic, Adventure, and Bravery. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.